opposites. We think of things in extreme. Like, is the person extroverted, introverted, right? So we think, is a person cultural, traditional, or modern? You know, whatever that means. You know, that makes a person modern as opposed to not modern, right? But then in reality, you're dealing with like a real person who is responding to what's happening in their life. And so people are not static. The situation is fluid. The Prophet said, "Al-Iman yazid wa yanqus," right? That faith, it increases and decreases. So their level of religiosity might change. The level of their traditionalness when they're at home might be higher than when they're in their own context. It might change as a result, having their own household. And so being able to adapt to the person who's changing. And so what ends up happening is people naturally evolve as time passes. And then as partners, you can grow apart from each other or you can grow together. And so the most rewarding part of marriage is when you grow together. Because as life throws you things, you actually become closer as a result because you lean on each other. Allah says in Surah Baqarah that you are garments to each other. The idea is that whenever you have a challenge, so then you kind of refer the matter, you tackle it together. So instead of one person dealing with life's issues, there are two people who are, putting their heads together. But then it's also the most challenging because you might want something out of life, you might have different preferences, and then you can easily kind of avoid that. And then what ends up happening is like you're going off on your island, and the other person going off on their island. Years pass, and before you realize it, you've actually grown apart. So how to grow together as opposed to separately. So now we're going to shift onto the other questions. I divided it by topic, and we're going to start with tackle the hardest question, which is how to deal with conflict, and then go to communication, inshallah. So we're going to start with the most intense topics and kind of lighten it up as we go along. That's my style. So our first question is, what do you think is the root cause of the rise in divorce? I'm going to start with Maliha.
I think it's expectations. I think that, now we're in a world where we have very high expectations, and we are in a place where we think we can have it all in terms of, and you can, but there's a balance. And I think that, biggest is having too high of expectations of someone that you're looking to grow with, and someone who is growing with you, at the same pace, if not a little slower, depending on where they are in life. And, when you can't match that, or when you feel like you can't connect with that, you feel like, that there's conflict comes up, because then you're fighting, you're arguing, you're pretty much saying the same thing, but you're saying it in two different ways. And so, I think the biggest issue in relationship is just having really high expectations of each other and not allowing each other the space that we need to grow appropriately to what we're comfortable with or what we can.
We also received a question about managing anger and how do I keep my cool, not overreact when my partner gets angry. And so I'm going to tackle that question. And I think a lot of people in their communication style, and we'll talk about this when we talk about communication, their natural impulse is to be either defensive or reactive, right? And so anger is an emotion, right? So a lot of people, we think of like, okay, you're being emotional, and we don't think of anger as an emotion. So people are angry because of something else. So we become fixated on the anger as to, ignoring what prompted the anger. So you're angry about something. And rather than talking about the something, we talk about the anger, or we talk about whatever it was that kind of brought out that episode. And so I think getting at the root cause of it is important. And the way that you can get to that root cause, both in yourself or in your partner, is by kind of dissecting that. And the reason why we never get to that question is because when we're engaging and we're having that conflict, and how you have conflict tells you a lot about your marriage and about your relationship, because people are always going to have conflict. It's about having healthy conflict that allows you to grow from that. And in fact, it's better to have an argument, have a resolution, right? And then you keeping it inside and not resolving it And so there are two ways in which that happens. One is in which you completely listen to each other and don't start thinking about what you're going to say next. Most of us, when we have conflict, our focus is on our next statement. Like, oh my God, I can't believe you think that. How can you say that about me? Or like, no, that's not true. I'm actually not like that. Or we feel judged. So either become like super defensive, we become really reactive, or we're like, no, you do that too, rather than saying like, yeah, I shouldn't do that. Instead it becomes like something that we can kind of respond to. The other thing is really listening to each other and understanding, what is upsetting to our partner. So if the focus is about how can I be a better husband, how can I be a better wife, and the wife is worried about how can I be a better wife to you, then the conversation is not about defending, it becomes more of an exploration. Like, how can I be a better spouse? As opposed to like, no, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So everybody's kind of defending themselves. And once you're in that position, there's going to be conflict and there's going to be anger. And some people also have unresolved ways of managing their anger. And if it's a personal issue, then that's something that we'll tackle when we talk about the personal questions. We also received the question about differentiating between bad or imperfect behavior and toxic behavior. Okay, so do you think you can take on that? I mean, how do you know when the way you're responding is toxic?
Yeah, so toxic behavior, and it kind of goes along with the red flags of relationships. Like Sister Maliha was talking about like communication, like if they're just not assertively, openly communicating, and rather it's passive, they're not really opening up about their emotions, whether it's passive aggressive, there's like an aggressive component, or just being aggressive, like belittling you, or criticizing you, or judging you, can be, really harmful, really toxic, or even manipulative kind of communication, like trying to get what they want you to do. So that can be really toxic. Even like the silent treatment, right? Like at the extreme end of poor communication, not communicating at all with you. Because that's not cool. Like you're both adults, you should be able to come together, manage your emotions, be able to resolve the conflict assertively, ask for what you need, your expectations. If someone's really just like not texting you back, if you're looking for a spouse, or they just leave the house, you haven't heard from them, they're ignoring your calls, I think that really shows you that they're not able to really communicate or resolve the conflict. So those are some things to say to look out for.
That's really helpful. I have a quick follow-up. And by the way, we're taking questions, so just kind of give me a wave if you want to jump in, especially on conflict or communication. I mean, looking introspectively, like you might be getting the barrage of text messages and you might ignore them because you're like, I can't deal with this right now. It's 8:30 in the morning. I haven't even checked my email at work. This is too much. I'm shutting down. But you can't write that because if you write, I'm shutting down, like leave me alone. Then you'll get a whole other barrage of messages. Or you might be like, I don't think this relationship is working for me, but you don't intend it to be manipulative, but it has that impact. I mean, how do you know whether you've crossed that line? Is there a fine line between where you're disengaging and then where you're using it as a tactic, like you said, manipulative behavior, in order to gain an advantage? How do you know when you've crossed over?
Yeah, so really letting your partner know, like, hey, like if you want to shut down the cake, let me cool off for a little bit, do what you need to do, giving that person that space to do that. Like, yeah, let's come back this evening and really talk about that. So yeah, just communicating that. Like, I need this time, not just kind of like disappearing. But yeah, and just like being manipulative, seeing what your intention is, like, and seeing if that person is really inconsistent. If you feel like you're really walking on eggshells around them, if you're feeling really drained by them, if you're feeling taken advantage of, those are like tune into yourself, how you're feeling and your gut feeling, and see if they really do empathize. They're just really like taking advantage of you. Those are some things to look out for. Like be true to yourself, communicate about that if you need to.
So Maliha, Risa brought up an important point about keeping your spouse informed about where you are and how you're feeling. This is a question that came up the last time as well. Is there a danger of over communicating to your partner? Are there things that you should kind of just keep to yourself?
I think it depends. I mean, you don't have to indulge in every little detail of your day with your spouse. I think that just giving them a snapshot is sometimes enough, but I think it also depends on the type of person they are, the type of relationship you have, if you've communicated how you want to, what type of communication you want to have. Some people like the whole start me at 8:45 and tell me what happened till 5:45. Like give me the whole list, including the guy who was driving really fast on the highway. Like I want to know everything, right? And then there's some guys who are just like, I'm glad you had a great day at work, or I'm glad that today wasn't as crappy as yesterday, or you're doing better. So it really just depends on what you've agreed on, or what you've kind of discussed, or what you pick up in terms of what each other's communication style is and what they're looking for, and go from there. So sometimes, it is too much, because sometimes your spouse may not want to know everything that you did, and sometimes your spouse is like, yeah, give me the whole details and write me a paragraph. So really just, body cues. It's a lot of the way the person reacts to what you're saying too. So picking up on those things helps. Because if you see that your spouse is on the computer and you're like, oh, why the way, then obviously not interested in how your entire day went. But if they're really tuned in and they're making eye contact, really connecting with you, then they really do want to know what's going on. So you have to figure that out as you get to know each other.
So that really takes us to the next group of questions, which are about communication. That's a big one. I know we spoke about that last month. And one excellent question that came in was, how do I manage seeking advice from those that are close to me without breaking trust with my spouse? I can talk about that from a religious perspective, but for a lot of people, you might be super close to your mom. You might have a bestie that you share everything with. Your husband is like, is this a third wheel in their marriage, right? But at the same time, this person you've known for 20, 30 years, your spouse is brand new. So how do you navigate that? I mean, are you breaking trust with your spouse if you're sharing with others? And that wasn't in the question, but also how do you manage friendships of the opposing gender, right? When you get married, you guys ask all these questions. So I'll throw in the hard questions. So Risa, do you want to take that? I mean, how do you, especially being newly married for 2 years, I mean, how do you navigate, the conversations that you have with your spouse? Do you keep that just among the two of you, or are things kind of open with family and friends? What's worked for you?
So I think it's important to set those boundaries, openly communicate with your spouse, hey, who can we talk to? Certain friends, who are they specifically? And what are you gonna share? It's, pretty much intimacy, you keep it between you and your husband. And then just, I think that they know, hey, I'm gonna talk to my friend, and they kind of know who your friends are, who's most important to you. And I think just letting them know, oh, this is something I want to talk to your mom about, or that we should talk to my family about, and really talking to them first, and then, using that as your a joint decision, we think this, or we want to set this boundary, or whatever it might be. So I think really talking to your spouse with hey, I'm going to tell my friend about this, and just seeing your purpose for doing so, I think could be useful to just put that out there.
Definitely. I definitely agree with that. I think that if you we'll take that in just a moment. I think that if you have to go to others to talk about an issue in your marriage, then the fact that you don't feel comfortable enough to have that conversation with your spouse is already a red flag. although it's very common, it's still a problem, right? But we may not be that aware about that we have to have those conversations as things are happening with our spouse. And then like even there's guidance in the Quran, which is that, that the marriage is described as being like a garment. And the primary function of garment is to cover yourself. So that act of covering, guarding each other's secrets, right? And that'll lend us to the next question I'm going to address, which has to do with talking about dealing with having conversations about your past, prior to your marriage. So part of that is that you protect each other's secrets, and we talked about, intimacy being something as private between spouses that you don't have that conversation with others. But there is a threshold in which there's a conflict that you may need to seek counsel from a therapist. You might need to seek advice from an imam. You might need to seek advice from family members. And so what's described in the Quran is that if there's a conflict that the two of you can't resolve, then you have to have a conversation about escalating. And then you find hakam min ahliha wa hakam min ahlihi. So then you involve two family members, one from each family. And it shouldn't be anyone random, it should be somebody who the other person respects as being wise. So like a wise elder, for example, that your spouse would value their input, right? So it's not necessarily the person who you feel the most comfortable with. Now, on the other hand, where does a therapist, your own individual therapist, or somebody that you seek advice from an imam fit into that? That falls in a totally different category. And even when you look in the books of religion about backbiting, which is another question that we thought, that's a special category because that is a closed circle of confidentiality, right? So now you're speaking to your therapist because you're not dealing with the issue that you're having with the spouse, but you're talking about the impact it's having on you. And so that's what the focus is. So if you're talking to an imam or a therapist about that conversation, then you're able to maintain the respect and the sanctity of that confidentiality because it's a closed. But if you start talking to a friend or talking to a family member, and this is why I think it's really valuable for you to have that mentor or to have the therapist relationship, so that way you have a place in which you can ask that question. Before we take this question, do you want to? Yes, brother.
Actually, I got confused. You're saying that when husband and wife are communicating, other than intimacy, that's not a problem. There's sometimes you have to go to some, let's say, parents or something to discuss, just to air it out to find out what the whole thing is. You're saying that can't be done without the spouse's knowing, because that would create another problem. You go to, I've got to talk to this to my person to make sure. You understand what I'm talking about?
I understand the question, but I have a counter question. Do any of us know a person who spoke to their parents about issues in their marriage and it helped? Everybody, have a serious fun, ask yourself. Because as an imam, I deal with thousands of cases like this. And the typical scenario is that there will be a whole layer of things that are, you open a Pandora's box. Like, for example, if your spouse has done something that upsets you, you might move away from that, you might forgive that, you might move on, and then your parents still remember that. Like, oh, remember you did that, oh my God, I can't believe that, or they might be offended. The other thing is like, okay, yes, sometimes family and parents can give good advice.
Yeah.
They'll be like, look, put this in context. However, that's not something that you can't gain from each other, right? From conversation. So in many ways, it's kind of a cop-out to run to your parents. I'm not saying it's religiously prohibited, right? But what I'm saying is, it's not the way that the Quran advises us to approach it. And also from a practical perspective, I don't think that having constantly going back to your parents for advice is actually a positive thing in the marriage. That's my opinion. I'm not saying that's the only approach, but I don't find that it's actually productive.
So you're saying there's no way you can talk to your parents after you're married? They're out.
About conflict, because we're speaking about
conflict. I'm talking about conflict. I'm just saying that with all due respect, I'm trying to understand if there's a conflict, you're at a point with communicating, and you do need someone, because you don't want to escalate it. You want to try to minimize the impact of it as much as possible. and you're not comfortable talking to the imam or to a counselor or whatever at this point. You just want to run it by a third party just to understand, so you can get a different view on it. What is wrong with that?
My opinion is that, and this is an opinion, is that escalating it to your parents is the worst person to escalate it to. Because the imam is not showing up, like you talk to me, like I'm not interfering in your life ever, right? You know, like until both parties come to me, and also I maintain confidentiality 100%. Nobody is hearing about it, right? Unless somebody's in danger, this is never going to anyone. Whereas with parents, you know, that circle is not necessarily observed. So I don't recommend that unless you get to the point in which the conflict has escalated to the point where it needs to be formalized. And then that's with your partners, with your spouse's approval and understanding. Because the other thing is like, let's say you're married and then you mention something to your mom. Your wife might feel a certain kind of way that like every time I have a bad day or I say something and then later she regrets it, and then now you've already told your mom about it. So it's like your mom is involved in real time. I don't know, can you do either of you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the type of conflict. I think it depends on the relationship that both people have with that parental figure. So if you, and you also have to ask yourself, can this parental figure be neutral? You know, do they have that ability? And 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be likely, because as a parent, you know, you're always going to side with your child, not intentionally, but like emotionally. It's just going to be like, what is going on with my child? Why is my child in this sort of hardship? Like those type of questions that tend to like go through your mind, right? But there are parents and who are neutral, who are willing to be that neutral party, who are, you know, who have wisdom and to be very impartial and say, okay, let's sit down, let's talk about this, and let's resolve it before it gets worse. So it's really like kind of knowing, and you can know this honestly, like through their parenting style with you as a child, how they treated you, your siblings, other people in the family, whether or not they were called upon by other family members to be that impartial party. And if you've seen that they can be, then chances are they might be able to do so in this situation as well. But again, 9 out of 10 times that doesn't happen. It's very rare, very uncommon. Because there's like that emotional piece that a parent will always have towards their own child. That will all exactly. It's like mama bear, papa bear syndrome, right? Like it just like, you know, it kicks in. No matter how older you are, whether you're 40 and you know, whether your child is like 50, doesn't matter. That mama bear, papa bear syndrome just kicks in, and you're just kind of like, I need to protect my child. How can my child be experiencing such a hardship? Why did this person do this to them? But if you have a parent who's very wise and who's very capable of being impartial and sitting down and saying, let's talk about this. You know, what's going on in your relationship? How can we help? How can we support? And if they're able to do that, then great. You know, then yes, use them as a resource, because of course they've had, you know, a beautiful relationship themselves. I'm sure that they have wisdom that share and, you know, give to the couple. But I think a lot of the times we also have like a fear of going to our parents because we don't want to burden them with whatever we're experiencing. Because we tend to feel like, you know, do I really want my mom to worry about this after I come home and I've resolved this issue with my husband or my wife? You know, chances are we don't want to seek that, and it'll probably be maybe our last resort. But again, it depends on the type of relationship your parents, what they've provided for you as a child. So yeah, so it really depends.
So we also received the question about tackling our past, and I mentioned also about friendship. So this is a tough one. I'm going to ask Risa if she'd like to comment on this. What about keeping secrets about your past or your present? What if that's only going to cause pain for your partner? And I'll comment on the religious aspect.
Again, I think it's so important to start off being open and honest with that person you want to spend the rest of your life with, and see if that secret, whatever it is, would really impact the relationship. You know, I think that we're right to know, like, if they're considering marrying you, or if you are married to them, like these things that could impact you, whether it's, past relationships that you had, whether we're, married before and divorced, like what went wrong, like, it's important for them to know these things that can help inform their decision if they're deciding whether, you're the right person for them. Or
From their perspective, right? Somebody would say that the religion, that, if God has kind of covered your past, right? And we've all made mistakes, we've all had experiences that we regret. In many cases, people have moved on religiously to a point in which, they don't want to have a relationship outside of marriage, but in the past, that's something that they experienced. Or maybe it's just, a relationship that they regret, they moved on from, they learned from. Or maybe it's something that's a traumatic experience that they aren't ready to talk about, which the religion would encourage them, to not have a conversation with their spouse, unless if it's something which is in the present, which has a potential for impacting the relationship. But so is there a danger of that being perceived as secretive and you're not being open? So what is there a misalignment where one person is being like super open, like I'm an open book and I will tell you everything about my past, my whole story, and the other person is seen as like being more guarded because it's like, okay, well that was how it was before, but now I'm a different person, so I don't really want to share. So how do they reconcile that? Or should that person be more open about their past?
I agree with what you said, like if it's a traumatic experience that you're working on in therapy, of course, that can be dealt with, and if they're ever ready to mention that to their partner, they can. And again, like past mistakes you've made that wouldn't really impact your current relationship now, like you wouldn't have to tell all of that. So yeah, I guess there's like a good balance. Yeah, in the present moment, if it is something that, that you would want to know, I guess, in your marriage, I think that could be important to talk about.
Definitely. And I would add to that, my perspective is that if you've changed and progressed as a person, you can talk about that. That I've had some past relationships and this is my past. And the reason I don't want to go over all the details is because this is how I am and this is what I've learned, this is what I've experienced. So you're not hiding the fact that you have a past. You're just choosing to communicate that you'd rather not go through the entire litany of your past, but you're not hiding the existence of it. I hope everyone's following that. So you're being open about the fact that there are things that you've been through, and then that also makes the other person feel more comfortable and more vulnerable to share. Okay, I've also gone through these experiences, and then talk about how that has impacted you and brought you to where you are today. And if there are things that continue to affect you that might affect your marriage, like, oh yeah, we still talk every week. So maybe that's something that you have to have a conversation about. We've also received a question, this one's from Maliha, about a partner who refuses to open up about feelings. How do I go about that? As an Imam, we get this question all the time, that I'm trying to communicate, especially we get the question, but my husband doesn't talk to me. It could be either gender, but that's typically the form of the question. How do you manage that?
I think exploring, what their, a little bit about their past, like how did they express their feelings in the past? Whether it's towards their parents, their siblings, how do they connect with them? Is it more, it's just kind of like learning their language rather than, it's not everyone's going to express themselves using, the right words or the exact word that we're seeking. So, asking them like, how do you express a sense of security, or what does that mean to you, or where, and within that context, you can kind of see what security means, to you as well as to them, and whether or not aligns in some way, and really just, kind of going a roundabout way, basically, of just kind of seeing how they are, how they express themselves, whether it's at work, whether it's with their friends, in their family system, and really seeing if that kind of answers your questions from feelings. Because feelings are so broad. And like, you're not gonna have someone who's going to always express happiness, love, excitement, whatever the case may be. But they might do it in a different way, or they might show it in a different way. So really just understanding what their language of that is and to see if that aligns with you as, in your relationship.
So if there are any other questions related to, we've tackled conflict and communication, these are the hardest two. So I want to invite everyone, if there are any questions related to those topics, this is a great time to do so. And also on Zoom, we're monitoring that for questions as well. If not, we have a bunch of questions on religion and culture, so I can relax now. So the first one's really simple. It's yes, please.
So oftentimes you have two people, they have two different communication languages, right? They communicate in different ways. And so sometimes it's a struggle to kind of adapt to speak the other person's language. So what are some tips that you can give to kind of meet a person halfway to bridge that?
I think just finding, kind of coming to that understanding. Well, let me go back. First, you'd have to identify like what their communication style is, right? Like kind of understanding it. Then you would have to see if it's something that you can meet them in the halfway to that bridge, like where you can kind of ask them, does this work for you? Or when I say this, does that help? And the other person should also try to do the same. So that meeting in the halfway, it's always about learning. Everyone really dislikes this word, but it's compromise, right? It's like
Sounds like losing.
I know, it sounds like losing, and that's why I try to stay away from that word. It's like a bad word. But compromise is really good because it really helps to navigate really tough situations like communication and not understanding what the other person's trying to say or how they're trying to say it, and really just kind of looking into them and seeing okay, these are the cues I'm picking up. Can I work with this? And if I can, then let me go a little bit further and see if I can ask certain questions to gain more insight into this person and go from there. So it's really just using it as your GPS and following it to see if you can meet them halfway.
Yeah, I think it's a good topic. Heavy again. Earlier, you guys were talking about trauma. And as providers and spiritual leaders, you all understand well that trauma can impact, prior trauma or current trauma can impact your relationships, future relationships. Can someone that's actively processing trauma or going through therapy even pursue marriage at that current stage? Or should they avoid and hold on? And how long should they hold on?
I think it depends. It really just depends on the person and where they are. Everyone processes trauma in a different way, and trauma could be so many different things. So it depends on the type of trauma, it depends on what they're doing to manage the trauma, it depends on how well or how aware they are of their, issues and concerns. And then kind of doing that self-check-in that we talked about in communication topic, of just saying, hey, am I ready? There is no perfect time in life, to say that I've got all my ducks in a row, so let me get married, because those ducks can go their own way anytime they want to. So really just asking yourself and checking in with yourself to see that based on what my experiences have been or are, how ready am I to pursue this next part of my life, which is coming with so many what ifs, which is coming with so many questions and concerns. And then really evaluating that either by yourself or with someone to kind of help you navigate how to go about it. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree. Just having that self-awareness, when you've been through a trauma, how am I managing my emotions? Am I able to manage my anger? And how am I resolving conflicts with people? Am I problem solving? Am I actively listening to them? Really having this awareness of yourself, and if you don't, going to therapy could be helpful with that. And then you can kind of know how ready you are to start a relationship or to look for a life partner?
Yes.
Follow up to that question though, so what if, how does a partner kind of deal with someone who's going through trauma? And now with your responses, you're relying on the individual who's going through trauma, but then how does the partner, kind of because there's some uncertainty of, especially if there's not enough communication about the trauma specifically, because they're still dealing with it, whether they're ready for a long-term relationship. So how does the partner deal with it?
I think the best way is to educate yourself in what that person could be experiencing. Like, let's say if someone, for example, is like the most common theme that like I've worked with is someone who's either been incarcerated or has been a war vet, right? So coming back, you're a completely different person because of your experiences that you've had. So now, how do I, as a wife of someone who has experienced this, deal with it, right? Like, how do I manage the situation of my husband, walking up in the middle of the night and leaving the house and not coming back for hours and me not knowing where he is, or, always having that uncertainty that something's going to happen, or he's going to wake up and he's going to be like, screaming, or whatever the case may be. So really educating yourself about how does PTSD work? How does trauma work? What does it do? How does it rewire our brains? And then also seeking support for yourself to deal with that, because that's a lot, to deal with when you don't know what's going to come next. And really finding someone, whether it's a therapist, going in with them if they're in therapy, and just really finding that support for yourself to really learn about what can I do to support them. I think being patient is a big part of it, and it's the hardest part of it, because we expect that, trauma is very internal. It's like, it's deep within you. It doesn't get resolved in a, there's no time span for it. There's no magic pill for it. It's like a journey for your life that you continue on. So you as a spouse need to become comfortable with that idea and know that, am I ready to take this on? Like, am I ready to support this person in that way? And then go from there.
Definitely. I think that's definitely a bigger conversation, and maybe that's something that we could explore down the road. So shifting to religion and culture, I'll take the easy question first, which is about the fiqh of mahar. So it's pretty simple. I mean, the fiqh of mahar is just, there should be one, and it should be something valuable. It can't be a gift that's something that's not valuable. It should be something that appreciates, not depreciates. And people, I get the question all the time because we have a reform for registration for marriage, and they're like, well, what should my mahar be? Well, I can't. That's for you to decide. And that's really kind of subjective, and that's really up to the society and what the norms are. But because everybody has different expectations, I think it's good to get the awkward conversations kind of done early on and figure out what that should be. But it should be something not insignificant. It should be something that expresses, because the reason for the mahar is to show on the side of the husband the seriousness of that undertaking, and show by doing something which is insignificant, it shows a lack of seriousness. And then on the other side, it shouldn't be something which is overly burdensome. The next question I really love, this is one that we don't hear about, and what's the deal with Islam and PDA? I was always told this, and this is like one of the questions that I've always asked, right? Which is, I've always been told it's not permissible without any kind of explanation or understanding of the boundaries. Do we have different boundaries in the West? So, do you guys want to take this before I get to it?
You want to take that one?
Something about PDA? You're a newlywed.
I know.
I want to know your
Hey.
back in the day when we got there.
Well, something that came to mind with that question was, you both got to be on the same page about that, and then talk about that. Like, hey, like I told them, say like, yeah, like I don't really like PDA, that's just how I am. Like, what's your comfort level with that? He's more into like, oh, you can hold hands or hug. So yeah, just seeing where you both feel with that, and it depends on like different settings. Like maybe if you're with your family or your in-laws, you might not do that as much. or maybe if you're with your friends or other couples, maybe you can hold hands or whatever you feel comfortable doing. But yeah, maybe just figuring that out and making sure the other person's comfortable, and that can depend on the state you're in.
I think Maliha already knows the story I'm gonna share. We were just married, I think, 5 or 6 months, and Maliha took a short trip. I think it was a day or two. So I went with her dad to pick her up, her parents, both of them, to pick her up. And so she arrived, and I made a huge sin of giving Maliha a hug. And she looked like she was going to kill me. And so after that, I broke her. And I was like, what did I do that was so bad? And she's like, why did you hug me in front of my dad? Meanwhile, her parents were like, oh, it's so cute. So her parents actually didn't have a problem with that, but she felt super uncomfortable. You want to talk about that? Well, obviously you don't.
I think it's a culture that you were raised in, right? So like I'm Pakistani, I was raised in a very cultural Pakistani household. You don't like, there's no PDA, there's just none. So I don't know, for me it was like really awkward and it was just, uncomfortable. Dude, and meanwhile, my parents, mashallah, they're very affectionate. They're very they check in with each other. They nudge each other, whatever. It's like, okay, But I think it really just depends again on what you guys are comfortable with, how kind of like what Risa said, you have to have that conversation early on, so that way you're prepared. Whether now I see, couples, mashallah, they're holding hands on the day of their marriage after they got just no, we don't do that. and again, it was more like a cultural. Yeah.
Your worst nightmare.
It's true. I think it just ends up being, the same, it's different. Because this generation, the generation I'm seeing now, in our community, the kids who are growing up, who are getting married, mashallah, they're holding hands, walking to the stage or wherever. 10 years ago, this was not allowed. I was told I can't even look at him on my wedding.
She got in trouble for smart. But this, this is 11 years ago. So actually things that, when we got married, it wasn't one of the questions, but I have a mixed background. My father's from Guyana, and Maliha's from Pakistan, and that was the most controversial wedding in the state of Connecticut. Now that's just Wednesday. It's interracial. It's not even an interracial marriage, but now they're just he's Muslim. It's 5 stars for that, and if not, it's people work on it. So I think the attitudes have shifted, but I have the unconventional, unpopular opinion about PDA. I think what's unfortunate in our community is that we have associated romance and intimacy with people who are not married, and that has polluted our thought into thinking that even couples who are engaged, they're affectionate, they go out, and then after marriage, it's okay, I don't have to dress up anymore. It's okay, that's the opposite of how we should approach marriage, where we should actually approach it with that sincerity and that seriousness, that we want to attract the attention of our partner, that we want to put in the effort, that we want to put in the small gestures, the grand gestures, in order to create an environment in which there's romance, there's intimacy, there's affection, there's thoughtfulness that exists within the marriage. And if PDA is a way of holding hands, is a way of bringing the two of you closer, and that's something that your spouse wants, then I don't understand why that should offend or bother people. Obviously, that's within limits, right? There's a point in which it's kind of too much, right? I mean, as the Prophet said, that there is a characteristic for every religion, and the characteristic of Islam is shyness. So there's a point in which it's like, okay, that's kind of something that's better at home, and that you should kind of preserve that for the home rather than out in public. But I think some people, sometimes because of culture, they overdo it. And so when they're in a relationship that's not a marriage, then we think like, oh, that's totally normal. But then when people are married, like, why is it inappropriate, right? If you're giving a hug or a quick peck on the cheek, or holding hands, I think people should be like, oh, mashallah, that's wonderful. But instead, we always go to that negative place, like, oh, why are they like that? They're so weird. Instead of being happy for them, that should be. So I know that's an unpopular opinion, but that's just my view, which is that I think a little bit of PDA is not going to hurt in a time in society in which people already struggle in their marriages, and we should really encourage people to have that feeling of excitement in their marriage. In the religion category, I want to touch a little bit on finances. So rather than getting into the fiqh, I want to talk about, I'm turning the questions a little bit. So rather than the ideal, everybody knows husband's supposed to be a provider, he's supposed to pay bills, but that's not the modern context that we live in. In this masjid, I think pretty much all of the ladies are working, they're with very few exceptions. And so typically you'll have two incomes, and then how do they manage finance? Should they be dual income? How do they structure it? Should they have a joint account? What do they do as recurring? Who should be the one saving? What do you guys recommend? Don't pick on me.
Imam Refai was saying, like, a lot of women in the workforce, and that's, I think what Sister Maliha was saying earlier, like, those high expectations, like, there's a lot of women, like, making good money, and at the same time, it's like, oh, I want a man who's making more than me, right? And then men can feel intimidated, like, oh, she is making more than me, I'm the man. So I think, like, my main thing with finances, like, don't think of it as like a competition. Like, you're together as one unit. Like, you can be a team, and kind of like share those financial responsibilities. Look at it that way, as like more income for the household, not who's like making more, who's making less. And just having conversations, if and not feeling insecure, like if like your wife is making more, like maybe she's whatever you agree to, like she's able to take care of more things. So like just kind of having that conversation there around finances.
When I work with individuals who are looking to get married and they're kind of seeking that, what kind of spouse I should be looking for, what should I be looking for in a spouse, finances like always comes up. A lot of the times, I've worked with women who are like, I had this one client, she was like super amazing. She was like, we were at a coffee shop having coffee together, and when the check came, it was like the guy was like, "We want to go Dutch," and like like we want to split it. And she's like, she had kind of like taken by surprise, and she was like, "Yeah, sure, no worries," when they both put their credit cards in, and she left that meeting feeling really awkward. She was like, "I'm not a traditional person. I'm not very cultural, and it's not that I couldn't afford like the $7.50 for my macchiato." She's like, "I could literally buy the coffee shop," like she's the CEO of the company, and so I'm not worried about that. It was just that I felt really awkward that he decided to just like rather than saying I got this, he was just kind of like, let's split this. I'm sorry. No, she did not. And that's what kind of like.
But there are a lot of women who want
Yeah.
that insisting to a different insinuation.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, again, it depends on your personality. And also, like I said, you have to have this conversation early on about what your expectations are financially. Life changes. When you're married, it's not about the first year. It's not about the first 5 years. You're going in for the whole lifetime, right? Like that's the goal. And throughout that lifetime, you're gonna have so many different experiences where your finances are gonna increase, decrease, and then be completely gone at some point, right? So you need to be having these conversations about how do we prepare for those things, you know, who takes what responsibility, you know, what's the expectation of each partner working, you know, contributing. And when you build that like confidence in your relationship through that, you know, communication, you find that you'll have such a higher success rate because you'll feel like you can really say like, you know, it's not about getting the bill at dinner. You know, it's not about me taking you out. It's about us going out to dinner. You know, it doesn't matter who pays or who puts down their credit card. Because at the end of the day, it's coming out of both of our lives, right? Like, you know, whatever the bill is. So it's being prepared mentally to have that and say, you know, let's go. We can't, I mean, you're not gonna go Dutch with your wife, right? You're not gonna take her out to like, you know, Cheesecake Factory and be like, since you had the bigger entree.
I'm gonna try this.
Please don't. But really just being aware of that and like feeling comfortable in saying and knowing that the money is both of yours at the end of the day. It doesn't matter who brings it in. And that there should be no insecurities about who makes more or who makes less, because I'm sure that
I think
especially
that's idealistic though. I think a lot of people come into their marriage with a lot of student debt. A lot of people have mismanaged their finances, you know, bad credit. You know, another person has saved a lot, they've worked really hard, they've been really frugal, and then one person might be earning more than the other person might be working part-time, people feel taken advantage of. In some cases, the wife brings in more income than the husband and she's still doing the housework more than the husband, he's not sharing, and then it's like, okay, but why are we putting our income all together? Like all of that sounds good, but then, or you might have a husband who's like, okay, well, like I'm paying for everything, but then you want to have your cake and eat it too, where it's like, okay, you're liberated and you go where you want, you have your own freedom, and then suddenly you want to be traditional when it comes to finances, that you're the husband, your money, you know, my money is mine, my money, and your money is my money. So this is what we're hearing. We're not hearing like, oh, it's a partnership, let's work together. Yes, this year.
I had to learn that when we got married. I was like, we're eating dinner. I'm like, wait, look at my credit card. She's like, no, I'll pay for it. I'm like, yeah, I'll pay you back. I'm like, wait a minute. You know,
I'll Venmo you.
You're married. Yeah, we were married, right? So you got this.
My whole family works in this. We have separate accounts. We manage finances.
Yeah.
Everybody's different, right? For me, it's much easier because then you never have to talk about finances when you have separate accounts. So we transfer money all the time. It's like, why are they doing that? They're so good. But for us, it's like so much easier to keep track of because then, like, you know, if she's shopping and like she likes something, she just grabs it. She doesn't have to message me. I don't care. It's her money, right? And then similarly, if there's a joint decision that's major, then we have a conversation. And then it's understood that you're gonna have a conversation either way, and it doesn't really matter whose account it comes from. But for other people, they feel like having separate finances means that they're not doing it together, and they want to have that clearinghouse where everything is done jointly. So religiously, it doesn't really matter. A lot of people think that it has to be done a certain way. In fact, there's very little detail that's in the Quran and the Sunnah. Right? It just says it should be bil ma'ruf. It should be according to what is acceptable and what is kind and what is, you know, observed culturally within that society. So the one detail that we do know is that the husband is expected to provide this minimum standard of living according to their socioeconomic class. If the wife is earning more than the husband and wants to contribute to that so they can enjoy a better standard of living, the husband should accept that. And the wife and the husband should be on the same page that, okay, we're going to join our finances together in order to facilitate that. However, it doesn't remove the fact that it's still ultimately the husband's responsibility religiously to provide that minimum standard. And these are not in contradiction. People think that doesn't make sense. No, this is how Muslims have always lived. Like people think like women just suddenly started working now. That is not true. There have been women with income, inheritance, businesses. Al-Qarawiyyin, the first Islamic university was started by Fatima al-Maqdisi. She was a famous wealthy businesswoman. Al-Azhar University was also started by women. So like, we have lots of Al-Qaf, we have lots of businesses in the past that were run by women. So it's not a new issue.
I was hasn't
Of course, that's the classical example of the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and that doesn't mean that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't involved. He also took care. So some people, they take the example to the extreme that like, oh, she was managing. They used to do it together. It was her business, and the Prophet ﷺ was operating it. He was the manager of that business, and so they made income and they established a good life together. There's another question.
I have a religious question. It goes back to what you make is very mischievous stories as well. Whenever you're in the courting process, is it fair to ask someone or expect them to work for a certain period of time? Like a lot of us are doing internships or residencies, we're very poor. Is it okay to like ask your spouse to work for a certain period of time? Is that Islamically covered?
I think that it is so important to have conversations about finances before you get married, and it is so rare. Nobody wants to bring up money other than like until the dad calls him. It's like, how much do you make? Show me your pay stub. True stories. True stories. Like, let me see your pay stub. Which also, like, if we don't trust, I had one case. The husband was married, and for a year into the marriage, I think I mentioned this when I did my program. He found out that like his wife didn't actually go to Columbia master's program. Like for a whole year, she was pretending to go to Columbia. And this is a family that I knew really well. So like people are like really motivated, right? And you see that like people, and which is scary for me. And that lends us to the next topic, which is about finding a spouse and compatibility, right? And I think just having those open conversations, asking open-ended questions, learning about that person is so important. So that way you're not blindsided, when you get married and you're like, oh my God, this person is like completely different from what I thought they were. And having those open, because if your expectation is that my spouse, like, you don't want to marry somebody who's not quote unquote settled. Personally, I don't believe in that concept of being settled, especially in the modern context. Like, if your wife is a resident post-medical school and makes $38,000, I think they make more now. I think they make 60 grand, 50 grand, whatever it might be. Or a better example, PhD student makes $35,000, $40,000. That might bother you, or maybe it doesn't bother you at all. It's like it pays rent, we have food, we're good to go. So the question is, you have to ask yourself, is that an issue for you? And if it is, have that conversation.
I think you just touched on it a bit, but I guess a lot of people just don't have that realization nowadays that there's a huge long life ahead of you where you're gonna make more money, you're gonna make less money, you're gonna lose a job, she's gonna have a job. And I feel like a lot of people are just like, right now, you got a job, yes I do. All right, and then after the shutdown,
All right, that takes us to the last question before we talk about compatibility, which I know a lot of you guys are interested in. What about culture? How do you balance between especially with in-laws, cultural expectations specifically? I mean, should you be yourself and upset them? Or should you pretend to be something that you're not? A lot of us are like, oh, I don't want to, be that bubble, or, I don't want to just be who my in-laws expect me to be. I'd rather they get to know me and love me for who I am. And the same for the men, works either way. Or should the fact that you're not trying be perceived as like disrespect or indifference? What's the right balance?
I think just having a balance between the two, right? You have to at some point be true to yourself and be comfortable with yourself enough to present yourself to your in-laws or whoever. And then you also have to be respectful in the manner that you do it. Because realistically, if you don't do that, you're gonna have this internal conflict where you're gonna be like feeling like you've just lost yourself and you're pretending to be something that you're not or someone that you're not. And that creates a lot of conflict where you start asking yourself, like, why am I even doing this? You know, like, why am I even pretending? Like, is this, you know, why do I need to pretend, you know, to be something I'm not? You know, I'll give an example. Like, when I remember when Refai's parents first came to our house, my mom was like a little too transparent. You know, she was like, she doesn't know how to cook. Like, here, she can clean. So,
It hasn't changed.
and you know, my mom was very clear. My mom was like, I know she can probably boil an egg, and like, I'm not gonna say any more than that. Like, I'm not, and you know, in a way, I appreciated that because I don't know how to cook. You know, like, I can make you a mean lasagna, but ask me to make roti, it'll be the shape of like Texas. All right, like, so just like, and it probably the consistency will be off. So, you know, that's just realistic. And I appreciated that she was that realistic with them so that they're aware that they don't expect that, you know, day 30, 50, whatever. I'm like, oh, come over for my house for like, you know, food. Guess what? It's gonna be from the hotel, like, or restaurant down the road to cater. Because I'm not gonna be able to present that. And it causes a lot of stress in a relationship because then you're constantly like, why do I have to be like this for you guys? Or, you know, and it goes both ways, right? Like, especially when you're in a intercultural marriage where, you know, there are a lot of things that are different with some similarities. It's like, why do I have to wear shalwar? You know, why do I have to wear this type of outfit? Or why do I have to speak this language when I can't understand it or don't understand it? And really just having that, you know, balance between being respectful towards your in-laws and your family, and also just staying true to yourself and saying that this is how well I can manage it. I think it's worked out for me so far.
So I have a different perspective, and I think they can be reconciled. But I think that many people want to like set that tone from the beginning that like this is who I am and accept it. But it comes off, it can easily be perceived as an indifference. So let's say, you know, you're from India and you're marrying somebody who's Palestinian, and the Palestinian is like, oh, this is Dabka, this is the best, you know, and then you're like, oh, that's weird. Like, they're not going to like hearing that. Because like certain things are like treasured traditions, they're like part of the culture, you know, and if you're kind of reject that, so in a way you're kind of rejecting the person. And so we think of culture as like a thing, but like culture is how we live, right? It's the way that, and culture is evolving. A family has its own culture. So it's not like just a culture, you know, like, okay, they're Egyptians, so there's Egyptian culture, right? You know, and then there's subcultures, like we live in America, like there are people live in different ways, you know, like Muslims in Philly live differently from Muslims in Potomac. I know that for a fact, right? And that's just geography, let alone race, ethnicity, culture, first generation, second generation, immigrant. I mean, there's so many layers, you can't unpack it all, right? But just getting to know the person, understanding what they like, what they appreciate, I think that's that like eagerness, like, you know, so like you might not like cooking, but if you like, you're with your mother-in-law in the kitchen and you're like, oh, like tell me how you make it, it's so awesome. Like that is going to have such a great impact. And then, but if you're so focused on like how you're feeling and like, oh, this is really uncomfortable for me, you might not understand that like your father-in-law, your mother-in-law is also uncomfortable. Like, okay, like I'm nervous, I'm sending my child to live with this person who doesn't respect our way of life, our background, and our language, right? So then, you know, somebody might be like, Gujarati, and then you're not Gujarati, they don't speak the language, like, oh my God. But then you like learn 4 words of Gujarati and like suddenly you're like the best ever. It's just like a few words, it's like not that hard. And I think ego sometimes, I don't know, it's a little too strong to say that it's ego, but sometimes it's, you know, we make the whole thing about us instead of about the unit and the couple. Like it's you and your spouse, and like there will very soon be a day in which you guys have your own house, you have your own kids, you have your own life. Like nobody's showing up at your door, nobody's interfering. Your mother-in-law is not micromanaging everything that you do. So you kind of have to, you'll get there, but a lot of it is just that vetting process and everybody feeling comfortable, just being patient with that. Which takes us to the main segment we want to talk about, which is about compatibility. The first one is for Reza. and this is gonna resonate a lot. How do I know if I'm too picky in finding a spouse? Did that ever cross your mind?
Okay, that's a really good question, that I work with my clients a lot too, therapy. But I think it comes down to your core values and finding someone who's really compatible. When we say values, like the direction you see your life going in. So it's like religion and spirituality, right? Where are you with that? Where's that person? You know, Islam's not just something you do, it's your way of life. You know, so if you're not compatible there, you're pretty much two people in the same house living different lifestyles, right? Or family, like, do you want to live near family? Does another person not really want to live near their family? It's more about their career, recreation, how you enjoy your time. You want to find someone who loves to do the same things as you. If you love traveling and the other person really doesn't want to, they just want to be at home, you know, how is that going to work out in the long term? You know, you really want your partner to do these things with you that you love. And so I think in terms of the values, that's really important too. You can be picky on, like, you know, how they're practicing or what they like to do for fun or family, things like that. But I think like in terms of being flexible with more kind of like worldly things, like how much is this person making? Like, do you really need somebody who has that same degree as you or who makes more money than you? Like, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a better marriage. I think if, oh, this person's super successful and they're making a lot of money.
More money, more problems.
Yeah, so something you can be flexible on there with their physical appearance. Like we talk about it with the Imam Refai, like, you know, people know that Tafsir is shorter than me, you know, but the society thinks like, oh, the girl has to be with this guy who's so much taller when she was wearing her heels. And it's like society's expectations. It's like maybe your parents' expectations, but you can really miss out on a great person just because like, oh, he's the same height and I want him to be taller. Or, you know, oh, they're not making more money than me, or they have a master's, I have a doctorate. You know, like there's certain things like that. It's not necessarily like gonna make it a better marriage. So I think in terms of that, like you should be flexible.
I've had that conversation where like, oh, I found like the perfect man. And I'm like, first off, please don't use the word perfect. Because like nobody's perfect. People like, I have the perfect person, I have the perfect match for you. Okay, if you're looking for perfection, there is something wrong. We had this conversation, I found the perfect person, but he's short. What should I do? I'm like, how am I gonna answer that question? I'm like, I have 3 letters for you. DSW. You don't need 3 inches. 1 inch, that's fine. You know, so some of it is just like people feel a sense of like I'm missing out, or there's like FOMO where like maybe there's somebody out there, so the person checks all these boxes, but there's like one thing, you know, like oh, or you know, she's not that highly educated, whatever the case might be. Like my family's gonna judge me, like, okay, you're a doctor, so like suddenly you have to marry another doctor, like you know that obsession. With having somebody on a similar educational background, but what you really need is somebody who has a similar mindset, right? So people feel like they're going to be judged, like, oh, couldn't you find somebody better? You know, and people have that with aesthetics, with looks too, where like they might find their partner attractive, but they're like, oh, well, this person is like a 5, maybe a 6 on a good day. My friends are going to judge me. Isn't it true though? Am I saying anything that's not real? Like you might be like totally okay with marrying the person, but you might feel like people are gonna feel like, oh, but you could have done better. And I think that actually prevents people from finding the right person who could be like a really good match. Which takes us to another question, which is about how do you find somebody? And I know everybody who's not married is on these apps. And I get questions from friends all the time, you know, like everybody knows that's on these apps. Also, is there are a lot of mental health issues that come out of that. You know, how do you navigate that? How do you take care of yourself and be on these apps when the whole app is designed, like there's so much toxicity there. You know, people get messages like send pics. You know, people get messages like which are like really inappropriate. And then you have other questions where people just swipe in for like exactly a very specific thing. So then you're like, okay, I'm not getting any serious people who want to get to know me. So how do you navigate being on the apps, because you can't think of a better way to find people, and then like taking care of yourself?
Well, I think if, you know, being on the apps is affecting your mental health, if you're starting to really have those, you know, issues related to your self-confidence, your self-esteem, if you feel like they're becoming more superficial in terms of what you're looking for, ditch them. You know, like that is your first and only red flag that you need in order to move on. There's so many ways to meet people. And I think regardless of how busy your schedule is, or you know what kind of work you do, or where you live on this planet, you can meet people in person at events, go places, do activities. So just, you know, look at that, see how it's affecting you. If you think like it's affecting your mental health in a negative way, which I'm sure it is, because, you know, let me tell you, like all these apps, they're filled with filters, like, you know, to the point of no return. You can, I think now even like Teams and like Zoom has filter. You can literally like, you know, there's like a filter on Zoom where you can put on lipstick without putting on lipstick.
Wow.
Like, what? You can like change the way your eyebrows are without actually
You have a
moving your
feature where you
eyebrows.
can have kids.
Yeah. But you know, I think it's becoming so artificial that we're so dependent on these like artificial ways to like find people and meet people, that there's so many natural ways of doing it. I think it's just, you know, when you start looking for that perfect person who has the perfect eyebrows or the perfect chin, let me tell you, it is not real. Okay, it's called Photoshop. It's very easy to get that. But you know, go out, you know, and just really step away from that. Anyone, I have a friend who actually owns like or invented or created Mismanaged. If they're listening to this, they're gonna be in trouble because that's like one of like the big ones. Just go out, you know, really seek that inside of yourself. Like, is that really what you want to put out there too? That this is who you are? Like this person who's just looking at looks and not really looking at what the person's about. And if it's not, then move forward.
So guys, forgive me, I'm gonna extend this by another 10 minutes. Inshallah, then we'll wrap it up. So Risa, also being really led here, what do you think is the most overlooked quality when looking for a spouse? What's the most overrated?
So yeah, that's a good question. Overlooked, most overlooked, I would say, when we were talking about it, like really being open. You want to find someone who's open to their personal growth. Like Imam Refai was saying, like they're not this, they shouldn't be this static person who gets defensive because you say, hey, you know, I really want you to do this for me, and I need you to do that, or can you manage your anger better? You know, so if they get defensive and reactive, that's not going to help. So if they're always like constantly growing, like, oh yeah, you know, like take responsibility for their emotions. Like, yeah, you know, I do gotta manage my anger better. Or you know, I do need to communicate with you more assertively. And if they're just really open to like fixing those mistakes, really actively listening to you and wanting to be a better person and growing, and you guys grow together, right? You're not just set when you get married and that's how you're gonna be. You should be growing together, and finding someone who does that just makes life so much easier because you're learning how to work with each other and live together, and you're not taking it as an ego hit or getting defensive. So I think that's really overlooked. So find someone who's like open to like improving themselves, like taking responsibility. Yeah, you know, I did that. That wasn't the best thing. Let me improve on this next time. Or yeah, that's a pattern that I have. Let me try to be better. Because you know, if you just apologize and you don't change your behavior, it doesn't really mean anything. So I think that's really important to look for in someone. Most overrated, I kind of mentioned it before, like, oh, this person's so like successful, you know, in our modern society is like, that means they're wealthy, you know, they got a good degree, a good status, you know, educationally, or, you know, their status at work. But does that mean you're necessarily gonna have a better marriage? You know, like respect and, you know, compassion, you know, how they manage their emotions. That's really gonna help you have a better, more successful marriage. Not like, oh, this person makes a lot of money. You know, and a lot of people say that, oh, they're successful, they're a doctor, and this and that, and they think that's gonna make the marriage great. So I think that's something we really gotta be more aware of.
I just want to add one thing to the overrated. So, and this is especially to the ladies. Like, I think naturally a lot of women are attracted to a man who's charismatic and shows strong leadership characteristics. And for those that know that about themselves, ask yourself whether you're willing to accept everything that comes along with that. Because I want to say where there are a lot of guys who are introverted, they're shy, they can't lead the conversation. You might think, oh my God, this guy is Fabi, you know, he's not cool, but he has a genuine heart, he's a really good guy, treat you like a queen. And we automatically dismiss the person because we want the guy, like enters the room, everybody kind of gravitates towards him, and like those strong masculine qualities. But then if you allow yourself to get, and maybe after having a conversation with that person, you can realize like, okay, this is not a good match. But a lot of us close ourselves off to that altogether because we're like, oh, our personalities don't match. But in reality, you're just gravitating towards a preconceived notion of how he should look and how he should speak and how he should carry himself. And for the guys, the same way. You know, they're like, oh, I didn't find her attractive. But part of it is because you didn't talk. There's physical attraction, but there's more to that. Like, if you get to know each other, you might find each other physically attractive later on. So these are common trends that I notice, is that people don't even have that conversation. Yes?
I have a question. So regarding choosing a spouse, for a lady to choose a man more successful than her or more educated, this is something so good for her. It doesn't matter for her. However, if a man can marry one lady who is more successful than him or more educated, sometimes in the man ego make problems in the future in the relationship.
Are you saying that men have egos?
Something. Unless he is so much confident about his character.
And you gave the answer right there. That's what it is.
How can you know if he will be confident or not upfront?
I think having that, see his reaction. Also, a man that is insecure about it also will want to marry someone who's more successful.
No, sometimes they just admire this, but in the real life, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So how can you get this upfront before going to a relationship? Because sometimes it cannot show.
I would love to be a house husband. Why not? If you get everything that you want and your wife is like holding it down, but there are men who would feel insecure, and then also changes it. Can I add to the question? It might also change the dynamic, decision making. So part of it might not be that he doesn't want a successful wife, but he's afraid of how that's going to affect the power dynamic. He needs his wife to be dependent on her in order for him to dictate decisions towards her. And I think that's usually the fear is that, okay, she's making the money, she's going to decide where we live, she's going to decide what house we buy, what we do, childcare. Okay, it's going to be daycare, but I thought my wife is going to take care of the kids and not me. So how do you manage that, especially when it comes to decision making? Is it the responsibility of the wife to placate the husband? Like, don't worry, I'm not, not going to dictate things to you, or is it the husband's responsibility to like check his ego?
I think it's more about checking your insecurities. I think it's not the ego. Like the ego obviously plays a part with the insecurity, but really like seeing like why does it make a difference? As to like who's making more. Again, like that communication about like finances. How are we going to run this household? everyone says like you have to have like a manager, like, you know, who kind of keeps everything in check at the household and like how things are run. I think both people can manage it. And I think it's even helpful when both partners like together manage a household because it makes life a lot easier and makes things run smoother and neither person feels the burnout. Because then you're not feeling like constantly having to like overcompensate or overdo or like, you know, work yourself to make sure everything's in line. So I think what happens is like, you know, I think it's so natural for our insecurities to pop up at different phases of our life because of what we're experiencing. So really, again, you know, having that ability to talk to your partner and sit down with him or her and say like, this is what I'm feeling. You know, this is what I'm feeling right now. Like, how do we work through this and feel like comfortable enough to do that? I think what often happens in marriages is that rather than utilizing your partner as someone that you can talk to, we tend to shut down in front of our partners and we don't want to talk to them anymore because we feel like maybe they might use this against us like later on in life. Maybe they might belittle us or think less of us. And again, it depends on your personality, your ability to communicate, your willingness to communicate and listen, and just saying, you know, I feel like this when, you know, you say you got a promotion, or, you know, I'm happy for you and I'm happy for your success, but it made me feel a little, you know, like sad. And that's okay, you know, to express that.
Or I'm worried, how's this
Or
gonna
how does it
affect?
affect us? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that takes us to our last and concluding question. We're gonna continue the conversation over lunch, inshallah. So, and I want everyone to kind of, you know, hone in and focus on this question. All three of us are gonna touch on it, which is, you know, what are the most important habits that we can build in order to have a successful marriage? If you're married already, what can you do that will make it better? If you're not married, what habits can you change that will facilitate a successful marriage?
Yeah, so I think when you're looking for a spouse, when you are married, like we've been talking about, expressing your needs, what you want in the marriage, the relationship. And a lot of times we shut down because we tend to mind read, like, oh, they're not going to take me seriously, or they're not going to care, or they're not going to meet this need that I'm requesting from them, or they're just afraid of what that person might say. So it's really important to remember, like, you know, we can't read their minds. We have to express assertively, like, you know, what's it going to look like in the house, dividing responsibilities, the finances, like really talking about that. And have those uncomfortable conversations. It's not fun, you know, everyone thinks, oh, it's going to be, you know, we shouldn't have these uncomfortable conversations. It's hard, but you really need to do that, you know, to really save those relationships. And I think we were talking about romance earlier. If you have kids, like, it's so important to still take time for yourselves as a couple, you know, like, really having the date nights, you know, spending
That's how you get more kids. Just stop at one.
Yes, and I can't stress this enough, that like, it's so important for the kids to see their parents have a healthy relationship. So you gotta spend time with them, put them to sleep at a certain time, spend time without the kids, talk about things that aren't related to the kids. I think like that romance, that affection, if it involves a little bit of the PDA, you know, if that's what's gonna save your marriage, you know, that's good. And what can you do to prepare? Yeah, just making sure you're like have those active listening skills. You're making eye contact with that person. You're looking at them. You're reflecting what they're saying. You're not thinking about what you're going to say next. You know how to manage your anger, your emotions. You're able to, you know, fight fairly. You know, talk one person at a time. Listen to them, not belittle them, not criticize them. So those are things you can practice in other relationships if you are looking to, you know, get married.
I would say like patience is a big part of any relationship. You know,
You said compromise, now I'm getting
I know, I'm using all the bad words. But no, I think like patience, self-reflection, I think those go so far in any relationship, whether, you know, and I think they get learned, you know, so early in life, and if they haven't been taught or haven't been acquired yet, it's really important to start working on those things, because you're gonna, like, in any relationship, you're gonna have to be patient. You're gonna have to be aware of the other person and how that other person is affecting you. So, you know, really looking inward and saying, how can I manage myself better? You know, just like Grace said, like very, you know, how do I manage my anger? How do I deal with conflict? How do I deal with my insecurities? How do I deal with, like, you know, the unknown, you know, and what can I do? And a lot of that self-reflection comes from your, you know, spirituality, if you have that as a big part of your life, and really using that to put it all together and say, this is me as a package, you know, this is how patient I am, this is how patient I can be. And your level of patience is gonna change, because, like, you know, you can be a Buddha prior to your marriage, and then you can be a Hulk once you have children. Like, you know, but even within that, like, in order for Hulk to get back to that calm place, he has to really he has to self-reflect, right? And he has to really hone in on what makes it feel good or what makes it feel calm. So knowing how to get back to that place. So yeah, so I think those two are really important.
I want to mention a quote from Mawlana Rumi. He said, of course, he's talking about love, but he says that your task is not to seek love itself, but merely to seek and to find all of the barriers within yourself that you have built against love. And so many of us, we're so closed off, you know, that not only is it hard for us to love someone, it's hard for us to accept being loved. Right, so we haven't opened ourselves off to someone, and then we do the language of like compromise and patience, and that's all wonderful. These tips are amazing, but at the end of the day, we're not bodies with souls. We're souls with bodies. We have a spiritual need as human beings to connect. And when you look at someone, just really look at them, like just eye contact, sit in silence. When the person is talking about something, and you just like touch them and look at them and engage them and like feel what they're feeling. This person is going through grief, and you're just with them. You just don't have to do anything, you're just there with them. You know, that we have a human need for that kind of spiritual connection. If you open yourself up and be vulnerable in that spiritual and that deeper way with someone, then they're gonna automatically let down all those barriers. They're gonna allow you in, they're gonna be that person for you. So my advice to everyone that I don't really follow is that, you know, you should be that person first, rather than waiting for your partner to be that person. And you're gonna set the tone for the relationship. And 9 times out of 10, the person will definitely reciprocate, be the same way with you. If that person doesn't, that's the red flag. And that means that, you know, you did what you have to do, and then you get that closure that you need. So hopefully, inshallah, now that we've simplified marriage for you, right, and you have all the answers, we're going to proceed to the next segment of the program where we enjoy a meal together, get to know each other. Hope it's beneficial. Continue to send us questions, and we'll have a conversation. All right, thank you.